Good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me and hopefully you can see me. And welcome to the BCS's New Year lecture. This is the first of three we're holding as part of our celebration of our 60th year through 2023. Hopefully you can attend all of them and all the other events that we've got going on. There's lots of things lined up. So welcome to this, what should be an absolutely fascinating talk. The person who's giving it probably needs no introduction. He is absolutely world-renowned. His skill, his knowledge, his interest, his enthusiasm, and everything he contributes to the cartographic community. Not only well-known, but hugely respected. He has a great long CV, which I'm not going to go through. He can introduce different elements if he wants to. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to tonight's speaker, which is Ken Field. Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Seppi. Who are you talking about, man?
I don't know, actually. I was making up as I was going along, Ken. You know me.
I thought so. Well, thank you very much for such a nice introduction. And thank you very much for asking me to contribute to the series and kick these anniversary talks off. I'm going to do what you're normally told not to do, obviously, and start with an apology. I'm on my own here today, except I'm not. The dog's around somewhere. And if he starts going off on one, I will have to pause and go and politely request him to not interrupt the talk. As we'll see. We should be all right, but we'll see. Okay, I'll share my screen and let's see whether we can get things going. Okay. Well, once again, thank you very much for inviting me. This is a talk I've given as a couple of keynotes over the last 6 months or so, and it's a really, I think it's a fun talk. It's kind of digging into things that are currently flying around in the cartosphere at the moment. One or two people and organisations are concerned with the idea of ethics, and so I thought I'd just weigh in with some ideas, and you probably won't be surprised that one or two of them at least are challenging sort of conventional wisdom and generally held notions about ethics in map making, and I hope really that's what I want to share with you today. So the context here is all of those people who talk about the world being awash with bad maps, and yeah, I'm one of them. Over the past decade, we've seen, with the rise of social media and with the rise of that instant news cycle over all of the wires and in the phones in our pockets, then we're seeing a lot more what we might call bad maps or fake maps or maps that might enrage professional cartographers, people who claim to know a little bit about mapping. So I want to really test the notion to see whether that's a new phenomenon and what, if anything, do we need to do about it. And I'll signpost the end. I'm not really sure whether we do need to do anything about it, but it's going to be an interesting journey for the next hour to see how I'm going to get to that particular point. And along the way, there's going to be some music. And the background now is a piece of music. And the musical interventions, some will be long form, some will be short, but there's a prize. So by the end of the talk, if somebody can correctly identify the number of musical references in the talk, and even better, actually be able to list either the song title or the performer, then they win a copy of this here book thing, what I wrote. So that's just a little bit of fun by the side. If you want to get a piece of paper and a pencil or a rote trim, anything you like, anything to hand as a map maker, then make a note of the musical interventions. Okay, I'll give you a clue. That's the first one. So, ethics. Let's see the globe spin. Bounce off my head, off the dog's back, and off. Here we go. So the title of the talk has reference to this very famous quote by Welsh politician Aneurin Bevan in the late 1940s, who quotes, "This is my truth, tell me yours." And it was really a phrase on the way in which politicians of the time seemingly avoided telling the truth in favour of alternative facts. You know, sort of the impact of the sort of left-wing economic structure, I guess, or things like that, you know, but blaming everybody but yourself. But what he was really saying was, well, this is what I believe, but I'm open and willing to listen to your opinion, which may very well be different to my opinion. And I thought, well, this is a phrase that kind of speaks to me. It kind of relates to our mapping world, I think, at the moment. And it's also happens to be the title of an absolutely great album by one of my favorite bands, Manic Street Preachers. So if you don't remember anything from this talk, you go and have a listen to that album afterwards, and your ears will thank you. So I basically stole Bevan's quote, a very unethical thing to do. And this presentation is really about the alternative truths we can find in maps and the reasons why that might be the case. And perhaps we can identify maps that are right, objectively correct, perhaps those that are objectively incorrect for one reason or another. But actually, I prefer to look at maps in a sense that none are right and none are wrong, but instead they all tell different shades of the truth. And what I want to do is explore this through the ethics lens, because like I said before, that seems to be in vogue. I want to look at how truthfulness is imbued in maps. And I'm going to get to a point where I start to focus on that new atlas, the book that I've just written to explore different map alternatives. And as I said, there's going to be a little bit of music along the way. So you ask 10 cartographers to make a map, or however many there are on this presentation, you'll get 10 different maps. You ask everybody on this presentation call to make the map from the same data, everybody will make a different map. I absolutely guarantee it. And it'd be quite boring if maps were all the same anyway. You know, if we all made the same map to the same standards, the same specifications, you know, we bought different newspapers, but they all had the same maps in them. It'd be pretty boring. So conceptualization, visualization of the map is really the output of a creative and a very human process, not just simply applying technology. And there's never a single solution to a particular mapping objective, nor, I think, an optimum way of representing and communicating mapped information. You know, we'd all do things slightly differently. So experience, intuition, possibly talent, we might say are useful, but we are all very different, and we all bring different sensibilities to our work. But of course, that means that maps can lie, right? Well, let's ask Miley. Let's see what Miley thinks about maps lying.
Do it for the phones. Ooh, maps don't lie. Maps don't lie. They actually don't.
You got a voice, Molly. Use it. Do it for the phones.
Signals always slowing when you walk out the door. You got big dreams of 5G, faster than before. We all just need connection.
Please feel free to sing along if you know the words.
Let's do it for the phones. They do so much for you. When they're out there all alone, there's something we can do. So don't settle for less. They deserve the best. More coverage, coast to coast. Twice the speed of Verizon's network, 4 times bigger too. When you download your favorite music, the leader is here for you. when they're out there all alone. There's something we can do. So don't settle for less, they deserve the best. More coverage coast to coast. Just make the call. Larger than them all. Just make the call. Let's do it for our phones.
Shocking. So that advert aired during the 2022 Super Bowl halftime show. I don't know how much they spent on that, millions probably. And of course, I watched that and thought, how do you get away with that? How do you get away with putting in an advert maps that blatantly lie, and on top of that, basically saying they don't lie? I mean, there's no advertising standards over here whatsoever, but it's just the principle, and that to me really, I thought, encapsulated this whole notion of why people are concerned about ethics in mapping, particularly the sort of the data maps that we see daily, rather than published topographic maps, I would say. And here's the print version from the same company. And it's kind of one of those Texas sharpshooter maps where, you draw your bullseye map after you've already decided what your conclusion is going to be. They want to say that T-Mobile's network is, all pervasive, it's everywhere. And if the resulting map that contradicts you or the data is wrong, you simply find a way to say the message in a different way to avoid other people being surprised by the messaging. And if the data doesn't support your conclusion, you get different data. Or you take out your Sharpie and change the map. Or you alter the information in your data set, or you just blatantly lie. Here, you flip the map and you put spiky things into the air, which kind of obscures and occludes information anyway. And what I really love about this is, if you look at the legend in the bottom right, it says no coverage. And that's in a slightly lighter pink than all of the other pink that shows coverage, which, of course, you're basically using the same symbol, aren't you? Anyway, advertising maps are great at this, drawing a map based on what needs advertising, whether or not it's the truth. The truth doesn't seem to actually matter if you want to sell stuff to people in this context. But of course, we know that. We know that maps lie because, Marc Monmonier told us several years ago in geographic circles, it's always been the case. We're all familiar with this stuff. And it was an instant classic when it was first published in 1991. How the choices that, how the choices that map makers make, consciously or unconsciously, mean that every map inevitably presents only one of many possible stories about the places it depicts. Same with that T-Mobile map. You can find all sorts of other interesting patterns and stories in it. The headline T-Mobile coverage is everywhere is not really the story that map shows, but that's what they're telling us. But of course, music beat Marc Monmonier as well. This is REM in 1985, 6 years before Monmonier even published it. With a song called Maps and Legends on the album Fables of the Reconstruction. This is the B-side to the 1987 hit single, The One I Love, which you're probably more familiar with. Let's have a listen. About maps. Why wouldn't we want to listen?
Didn't seem real. He just sings whatever he sees. Point to the legend, point to the east, point to the yellow, red and green. Maybe he's caught in the legend, maybe he's caught in the hood. Maybe these maps and legends have been misunderstood. Maybe
There we are, Michael Stipe. And what fantastic makeup. But I guess now I need to get back to the cartography, and for that I need another legend. And here's Menno Jan Kraak, former president of ICA. I took this candid picture of Menno Jan, a cartographic legend, in 2016. I absolutely knew it'd come in use, but I've very unethically used it in this context. So apologies, Menno Jan, but it seemed to fit. Okay. So ethical territory goes beyond organizations and their constraints. It goes to the individual. And a guy called Michael Carell, who works at Tableau, recently characterized that there's basically 3 types of people when it comes to those making maps: honest people, liars, and bullshit artists. Okay, well, remember, both an honest person and a liar at least are interested in the truth in what they're telling. So how do we identify these 3 characters? Well, the honest person wants to tell you the truth, so they have to know what the truth is, whereas the liar wants to convince you of something that they know is not true, which also entails that they know what is actually true. They're just choosing to say the opposite. And of course, you know, the same people can do different things at different times. The bullshit artist, by contrast, couldn't care less about what's true or false, and their goal is simply to say whatever will accomplish their aim. And they don't much care if what they're saying is true or not. Now, I suspect everybody on this presentation this evening probably all considers ourselves as ethical map makers, probably in the same way we all consider ourselves to be excellent drivers. But it's very difficult to identify unethical map makers unless you really know what you're looking for, because unethical map makers often hide in plain sight. Take the maps I make, for instance, because I can't pick on anyone else. I've got to pick on myself. Now, I like to think I follow ethical ideals, but consider the context. All of the maps you see that I make are made as part of my work, and I work at a privately held GIS company. So although my focus is on helping people make better maps, whatever I might claim, by default, they're made using Esri software, Esri services, and Esri content. So they're marketing. The maps I make are marketing, regardless of whatever I might claim their other intent is. So there's always context that's hidden behind the maps that people make. But I'm supposed to be a professional cartographer. So does that somehow automatically make me and my maps trustworthy? I'm not sure. Let's have a look at a few untrustworthy maps and see whether we can test this. So you're probably familiar with this. This is the famous Sharpie Gate map. It's a perfect example of someone caring more about the appearance of the data and how it's portrayed, rather than the underlying truth or falsity of the data itself. So it's very easy for people to conflate the data with the truth when a map or a chart is presented to show the data. And where it, in this case, was like, well, here is the data. This is where the hurricane is going to go. But people perform less due diligence with maps and charts than, say, the written word. I mean, who bothers looking for the source in a map's data, for instance, or further, if that source is trustworthy? How many of us have raised eyebrows whenever we have to get into conversations about metadata? And that's part of the issue, I would suggest. And how, on this map in particular, how many general readers understood the notion of the cone of uncertainty for the path of a hurricane and mistake it for the breadth of imminent destruction, regardless of whether it was going to go to Alabama or not? And the context of this map, of course, is, should we believe the President of the United States? I mean, we should, but maybe we should also be skeptical as readers. And does the particular person who, was the President of the United States at the particular time deserve more or less trustworthiness as the next one or the one before them, etc.? Does the post come with trustworthiness, or does the individual still need to earn that trustworthiness? Okay, let's try another one. So this is a map from quite some time ago, and it looks very complex, looks very interesting. A nice piece of data art, I would suggest. But there's so much complexity you can hide in a map. Excuse me. The data collection process, the uncertainty, the assumptions, the outliers, basically whatever is inconvenient to your story. It's also much easier to share a JPEG like this than it is to create an interactive map or a Jupyter notebook or something like that, which invites exploration and gets people into the nitty-gritty of the data itself. So using an arbitrary map to make an arbitrary claim and hoping nobody checks too closely, I think seems to be becoming the commonplace mapping type. So it's a map of location of tourists shown in red versus locals in blue. And the map claimed to show, and I quote, incredible new detail about demographic, social, and cultural patterns. I mean, does it? I question that particular statement, that assertion. It's perfectly pleasing to look at, but I'm not sure it does what it says on the tin. And why do I think that? Because the data is from geotagged tweets. And at this point, and this map is about 8 years ago now, only 1% of all tweets are geotagged, 13% of which are imprecise. 67% of internet users use social media, so there's a whole raft of people who don't, and only 16% of those used Twitter at the time. Those were mostly adults between 18 and 29, mostly male and mostly white. So that incredible new detail about social, cultural, and demographic patterns is inherently biased simply because of the data that was used to collect and illustrate this particular pattern. And the other problem, of course, as most people here will recognize, is that red is on top of blue. It's two layers of information, so the red is obscuring any blue underneath it anyway. The blue's lost. But do people question that, or do they just take it as read and say, oh, that's what the title of the map suggests I should be seeing, therefore that's what I'm seeing? Because that's what they're told. Do they question it? So I think we often inadvertently fool ourselves with our own maps in that kind of sense, that type of map, which might be summarized as a continuum of form and function, the well-worn form and function aspect to cartographic design, the organization of our own ideas and the ideas we want to share. And therefore our maps all fall somewhere on this continuum by David McCandless. Do we check to make sure that conclusions from our maps are sensitive to different choices of methods we use or the data we collect? Do we think we're free from all those self-serving reasons for making a map in the first place? As I said, all maps made by me and my colleagues are effectively marketing. That's the ultimate reason for their existence. Do we publish maps that support a belief but ignore the ones that don't because it's convenient? Or it's inconvenient if we tell the complete truth, so we'll tell a partial truth? Do we make so many different maps that at least some of them, by chance alone, just have a pattern we think is interesting, so we throw that out into the ether? Maybe do we end up seeing what we want to see in our own maps? This is the so-called mirage effect. We're looking for it, so we'll probably see it, and then we'll repeat that to the map reader. And maybe we publish maps as a way of avoiding a proper written and analytical statement or a justification, or we don't qualify our maps with those kinds of statements and support when they need to be. I was also fascinated by this fairly recent end of last year, fairly recent New York Times op-ed by Greg Bessinger, who brought to the public's attention how terrible modern maps have become. And I read this, and it's a little bit like the print maps are dead statements that we've been hearing for the last 20 or 30 years. And we'll sit back and go, well, none of this is really very new. These are very well regurgitated and well-worn tropes, which again, I'd like to sort of test a little bit. So, world wants maps perfect and free of misinformation. Is this a new thing? Is misinformation and fake maps something new? Well, I don't think so. For good reason, maps have always omitted information, and they're versions of the truth that stakeholders want you to see or not see. Here's two beautiful Ordnance Survey 1 to 25,000 map sheets published in 1961. They're detailed. They have the aura of accuracy and completeness. They are documents of scientific record. I'm going to smoosh these two sheets together and zoom in a little bit. And in particular, I want to look at these two areas of unassuming countryside. I would look at this map and, oh, it's beautiful, perfect for a nice walk along the footpaths, bridleways, streams. Lovely. Except in 1950, these two areas were designated as atomic weapons research establishments where Britain's nuclear missiles were assembled. This is Aldermaston and Burfield. And along with over 3,000 other sensitive sites, they were omitted from our national maps. Because why would we want this information to fall into enemy hands on published maps? Now we can see that on a satellite image where they're clearly visible. And even though this is a modern image, there's examples of imagery that have been deliberately pixelated for similar reasons. There's no countryside in these areas. These are heavily secured industrial military complexes. That was the 1950s. What about today? Well, even Ordnance Survey products are detailed. They then at least now show building outlines. You know, there's a sort of a move towards saying, well, this isn't beautiful open countryside. You know, you're not going to go for a nice walk here. There's buildings. Perhaps that's enough to put you off for your Sunday afternoon stroll. OpenStreetMap actually names the sites with the AWE prefix, and they've got this sort of pink wash over the top to suggest they are a different land use category altogether. And this is Esri's base map. This goes all in, saying exactly what exists at Aldermaston. This is an acronym. It's the full atomic weapons establishment, though somewhat blended innocuously into the map by using the same sort of symbology treatment. It doesn't suggest anything different to what surrounds it. But funnily enough, at Burfield, nothing. It's still empty. So I've just shown you four versions of the truth. But which of these maps is the truth? Which could be trusted more than the others? What of the atomic weapons establishments these days do we know from the maps whether these are still active military establishments or not? It's very unclear. So are today's digital maps any worse than those of yesteryear in terms of the claims that they lie to us? What about the people making maps? Are maps now made by bad actors using bad data to deliberately tell bad stories? Were maps made by people with much higher morals and ethics in yesteryear than today? Well, here's a Nazi propaganda map from the early 1930s, just as Hitler begins to gain control. And notice the use of very dark red, or highly saturated red, I guess, to illustrate border areas surrounding Germany. These are the areas under threat. Remember, red means danger, right? And they're under threat from the surrounding areas depicted as dark, black, oppressive surrounding countries. This map has been designed with very, very specific visuals in order to tell a very specific story. This is Nazi Germany under threat, which is contrary to what we now know happened, of course. So no, the sort of modern map Breitbart used to explain the strength of Trump's 2016 win aren't anything new. Unethical map makers have always existed. Some operate individually, some on behalf of a propagandist machine they're paid to work for, and some maybe who just work for an organization with very specific specifications and constraints. These aren't maps made by individuals, they're made by individuals on behalf of an organization that pay them. Were maps never used to warp people's impression of a place? Well, here, this is McDonnell-Gill's 1914 Wonderground map of London, an absolutely beautiful map, commissioned by Frank Pick of the Underground Electric Railways Company to improve the brand, you know, the London brand. And the Underground at the time was used almost solely by commuters. And the point of this map was that the design was intended to distract commuters from their travelling conditions and also improve off-peak use. So how did McDonnell-Gill go about doing this? Well, a mix of cartoon, fantasy, Yes, topological accuracy, but this became an instant hit with the traveling public. Who wouldn't want to ride the underground when, you know, the above ground looked so beautiful and inviting, and we're going to experience these great looking places? It's a medieval townscape in a medieval map style. So the map style and the design has been used to support a very particular aesthetic and to encourage people and to give them a particular impression of London at the time. So no, Google were not the first people to realize the value of a map as an advertising hoarding, or to modify the content to suit the people you're trying to sell something to. You know, this is Google Map of Amsterdam. When I visit, it just so happens to have my favorite restaurant slap bang in the middle of it. So, you know, these are the maps that we have now. They're no different to McDonnell Guild's attempt to illustrate a place in a way that appeals to you, in a way that speaks to you, over and above just the pure topographic accuracy. Is the alleged selling out of cartography because maps used to be made by experts? And did they? But perhaps now they're made by anyone due to technological developments, the fact that, you know, anybody can make a web map now. Well, here are some great examples of maps that you probably all recognize and which were all made or envisioned by non-cartographers. So there's proof if you need it. You don't need to be a cartographer to make a great map, albeit that some of these weren't actually drafted by these people themselves. These are the names that have become synonymous with these very, very fantastic looking maps. And what about if we bring things up to date a bit? Neither do you need to be a trained cartographer now, as these contemporary map makers prove. So the point being here that it's way too simplistic to simply say that access to technology has made maps worse because non-cartographers now have their paws on the tech we use to make maps. A map is still the product of its maker, not just the technology used to make it. Okay, should we have a musical break?
Same as it ever was. 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 Same as it ever was.
So I would argue none of these alleged problems with modern cartography are new. I'd suggest it's the same as it ever was. Though maybe it's easier to make a good or poor map now because of the massive reduction in time it takes to make a map. You know, we're not dealing with 6 weeks to make a map now. We're dealing with 6 hours or probably less, sometimes 6 minutes. You just drag some data onto a web map and boom, and then you tweet it and out it goes. Maybe we just simply see more of them. They're increasingly transient, ephemera, just because of the rapidity of the daily news cycle and our incessant media feeds. It kind of means certain maps get noticed and you know, amplified and pushed more and more, and that perhaps sometimes raises eyebrows in our community, at least. So let's take a look at one of those maps that caused some degree of consternation and then got me thinking about what I might be able to do to help deal with this issue. So here's a so-called fake map. This is a famous photo taken by Reuters journalist Trey Yingst as Trump moved into the White House. As I've said many times before, who wouldn't have a map of their victory on their wall of their new house? I certainly would. And Reuters quotes Trump as saying, here, you can take that. That's the final map of the numbers. It's pretty good, right? The red is obviously us. And he's right. The map isn't wrong. But this sort of map presents a very partisan view of the truth. Geography, population density, electoral geographies, map design decisions have clearly modified the message in a very specific way to put as much red on that map as humanly possible. This one obviously suited Trump's view of the truth because it's got an awful lot of red. But of course, it's only one form of mapping elections or any other thematic data set. And other truths exist. Now, I have no idea who made this map. I have no idea whether they knew what they were doing in using these mechanisms in terms of technique and messaging. I suspect they probably did, but they might have just happened across this map because it's a default in many, many pieces of software to create diverging color ramps like this in, and you pick red and blue, and that's what it's going to happen. Is it unethical? Because that's the accusation. I don't think so. Do I think I can make a better version of this data set? Or perhaps everybody on this call? I think, yeah, we probably all could make a better version of this map. But we might not be coming at it from a point of view of speaking to a Republican base. We might be coming at it from the point of view of trying to make something a little bit more objective and balanced. Side note, I've got no idea where this map currently exists, although I do know it was recovered from Mar-a-Lago by the recent FBI raids. So hopefully it's now hanging up somewhere in FBI HQ. So in early March 2018, I made this map. And this map's a daisy-metric dot density map of the 2016 result. It's one dot is one vote. And overnight, it went a little bit viral. And that was a real pity because I hadn't actually finished the map. I just got overexcited that ArcGIS Pro had actually drawn 135 million dots or whatever. And so I screen grabbed it and put it on Twitter and went to bed. And to date, it's been liked over 10,000 times, retweeted over 5,000 times, been seen by 2 million people and led to 250,000 active engagements. Now, I have absolutely no idea whether those metrics are of any value or even whether they're truthful. And I don't particularly care. But I can quote those numbers as a way to try and justify that this map is great. But the context is it's meaningless. But of course, that meaningless data doesn't really stop memes happening. And this is one I particularly liked from Thomas de Boer, as he mashed up my map into Trey Yingst's photograph. Now, which map appears more truthful to you will depend very much on where you stand politically, but they're both equally correct. And another side note, when I present this slide to an American audience, you can see the discomfort as people wriggle in their chairs, because one map will speak to one half of the room and one map will speak to the other half of the room, and they start looking at each other very skeptically. Fun times. So I used this image in a page of the first book I wrote, and that Cartography from 2018, really to explore the issue of ethics and what constitutes a truthful map. So as we've seen, maps can be accidentally disingenuous about the content. They can use misguided constructional techniques. They may even be deliberately designed to be persuasive or propagandist. And that might be deliberate or unconscious or a bit of both. So the ability to accidentally or deliberately make a map in ways that might misconstrue meaning raises these questions of ethics. And I also kind of reworked the code of ethics, or a list of ethics, that Borden Dent proposed in his book on thematic map design from many years previously, which is one of a number of such offerings we can look towards for guidance. And here's that list. So I kind of reworked it, but it's broadly what Dent had suggested. And I would call this an academic version of a code of ethics for cartography. How do we as makers of maps, though, attempt to bring truth and objectivity to the process of making the maps? Do we have to follow this list to the letter? Is this some sort of badge, I guess, that we all subscribe to as makers of maps? Does everybody in every profession have these kinds of ideals, these altruistic aims that guide them? I guess they do to an extent. There's all sorts of ethics in law, in medicine, that are related to the professions. So it's no surprise that cartography wouldn't have these kinds of codes attached to them. I think they provide a very useful, very practical way of thinking about and applying ethics to the practice of making maps. So that's what we might call the academic version. This is what I might call the society version here. The Locust Charter is part of the American Geographical Society's Ethical Geo Initiative. seeks to improve standards of practice in geo more generally, but it applies to cartography. And it lists 10 founding principles that are intended as a call for action, as some sort of mantra we can abide by as geo professionals more generally. And maybe what we're seeing here is the fact that, there are very few geographical or cartographic societies or professional organizations that, give us that professional standing in society. It's not like law or medicine. We don't have those badges. I mean, we have, RGS, IBG, accreditation, those kinds of things. And we have status that we recognize within our community. But I'm not sure we necessarily have the status that the general public would recognize. Maybe these are the kinds of things that we can hang our professionalism onto to claim our ability in working with spatial data and making maps and products that people use in their own work. So I think we could argue that in this kind of post-truth world, our individual, maybe our collective professional and ethical responsibility is to abide by these types of codes, which guide us to deliver maps that people can genuinely trust. As I demonstrate in the examples at this point, all maps lie, but some maps lie more than others. And I think minimizing the spectrum from gratuitous to accidental lies has to be probably the aim. So those little white lies we infuse in maps to make the main message clear. You know what I'm talking about. You offset a railway from a road that in reality, they're alongside one another, but we have to create a slight gap between them on a map so that they're individually discernible. We'll open a sort of a bay very slightly on a coastline in order that we can see that there's an inlet. These are all what I call little white lies on maps. This is generalization, of course, as we know it. They don't do any harm as far as I'm concerned. I'm absolutely fine with that sort of stuff. Okay, so I'm absolutely have to have a look at this one. Of course, BCS have their own code of ethics that apply to membership, and that's fine. And look at the last bit that I've highlighted. Basically suggests that people can be expelled from the society for contravening the code. I've asked around. I don't think anybody's been expelled yet. Maybe I will be after this meeting. I don't know. So I'm not really sure what the penalty for non-compliance is. And does it matter anyway? Because I think, this is a code for how we behave in life, really, not necessarily just a code for what we put into our maps. And I would also argue that, if you're somebody who's working on military maps, because of the need to obfuscate sensitive information, are you not making some sort of subjective map rather than objective map anyway? But you're still, you're still making a map that your employer wants. But does that contravene society codes like this? I think there's some very interesting questions that get raised about how individuals and their employment and the maps they make fit within these sort of constructs. And here might be an industry version. Of course, Esri's come up with one. We've come up with one. This wasn't drafted by me. It was drafted by other people at Esri as a guide for map makers to keep them on the path of righteousness. Now, as with the others, the intention, I think, is noble. What's the context? The context of a privately held company suggesting such guidelines is possibly questionable. And of course, you'd hope that all maps made by employees of said company complied implicitly and explicitly with these guidelines. They don't. Quite simply, there's different maps come out of different people and get used in different ways. And these guidelines aren't kept by everybody. It's worth noting, though, that, despite me being a little bit facetious about all of this, all of these initiatives are designed to kickstart wider frameworks, wider discussions. And this one in particular is being taken up by the International Cartographic Association as a way of developing guidelines in the ICA, you know, the overarching sort of global society. So it will eventually become another society version. Okay, now when I've done this talk in person, and we can play along now, and I'll just guess the answer. I've asked people to put their hands up if they make maps, so you can all, as long as you're on your own, no one's laughing at you. You can put your maps. You can put your hands up. How many of you make maps? And keep your hands in the air. Now, I then say, keep your hand raised. Excuse me. Keep your hand raised if you can honestly say you have no outside influence, constraint, organizational requirements, specifications, clients, or anything else that impacts how you make your maps and how they end up. And at this point, pretty much everybody, I guarantee, will have put their hands down, because none of us make maps in a vacuum. So I therefore come back to that point I noted earlier. I'd question the value of these guidelines, even if we agree with their altruistic aims, because we all have paymasters and our hands are often tied because we all have mortgages to pay. We all have food to put on the table. So if somebody says, I don't like that green, make it red, you make it red. That's just the nature of our industry, broadly speaking. So I think those lists of ethical rules may be slightly counterproductive beyond simply guidance. I think we shouldn't overplay these kinds of things. For instance, as I mentioned, how can you be accountable to a society over and above your employer or your client? I don't think you can. I can't go saying to my boss, well, I'm sorry, but BCS are going to throw me out if I make the map how you want me to make it, because they're going to counter and say, well, we pay you. And that's fair enough. I also think it perpetuates the us and them divide that many new map makers might feel, if we're trying to continually set ourselves apart based on our so-called professionalism. I think it sometimes also gives the appearance of stuffy dogma and gatekeeping, which is perceived as a problem as well. And how do we communicate these guidelines anyway? I mean, we all know this stuff. I don't think any of us make our maps deliberately trying to go against these kinds of aims and objectives. But the people who I would suggest we most often suggest need to know these things don't subscribe to our traditional societies anyway. They don't care. They're not going to read this. And what ethics are we talking about anyway? I've not got into this, but I mean, here's an example. The Chinese Communist Party have ethics, but they likely wouldn't match what we might put together as a list of ethical standards. It's just different. So how can a single set of ethical guidelines be relevant across a melting pot of different people, cultures, and ethical ideals? So I think what we should probably do is move away from what might be seen as rules for cartographic practice to be more inclusive and empathetic. And these codes are really more about how we conduct ourselves in everyday life and not just in the map making process. What I'm not suggesting, though, is that means anything goes, and we still have rigor in our own work in promoting the value of cartography when we recognize subpar maps. And of course, musicians have known about this dichotomy and the problem of giving orders on maps since 1973, which is the 50th anniversary of Dark Side of the Moon. So here's another little musical reference for you. Let's play a little bit of Us and Them. Now this is an over 8-minute piece, so although I've got the entire record on here, I don't think mind you might prefer listening to this than me. But anyway, it comes to the line, and the lines on the map move from side to side, and get all sat, blah 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 blah. Maps in music. That's enough. So here's the problem. What happens when we see maps from another domain that clearly contravene our design standards for effective communication? What do we do with all these lists and codes? Well, we might call it out, and we might do that in lots of ways. We might try to do it with humor. We might try to do it by suggesting alternatives. We might try to do it by encouragement. However we might do it, and the styles we might do it. It doesn't rarely affect change, particularly within transigent communities, the ones perhaps who we think would need to know this information even more. We often get accused of gatekeeping in cartography because it's a cheap and it's a very easy accusation for those who reject our advice. So what do we simply do? Do we stamp, do we stamp these kinds of maps with our disapproval? They don't conform to our, we can't do that. The very action of our stamp of disapproval is a potentially divisive act anyway. So in thinking about this, one way we might force ourselves to bring more rigor to our work is through self-reflection and critique, and encourage others to do similarly. We might keep codes and mantras in mind, but applying them in practice is difficult. But maybe using something like a checklist to help us square off things that we should consider when making map is a more practical way to justify decisions that have been taken. Justify decisions to yourself, to give yourself checks and balances, but also to help check you haven't missed anything, and also to provide ways of being able to talk through your decision-making process with whomever it is that you're making the map for. And the other thing we could do is more than codes, mantras, and checklists is to develop examples that help to guide people. I'm increasingly convinced that providing people with good examples is a far better way of encouraging better mapping than simply pointing people to the codes, the lists, and so on. Let me just go back. There's an automatic advance there, sorry. And that's kind of been my intention for a decade or so in creating alternative maps for different election cycles. It's kind of my attempt to explain and illustrate how meaning in a map can be designed for good or ill intent and to mediate the message. I think it's useful for both map makers, but also map consumers who are then better able to recognize and question what they're seeing. That's the other side of the coin, of course. And the point of all this is perfectly summed up by Randall Munroe in this fantastic XKCD comic. You can make a map of anything, to say whatever you want, and it won't matter because no one checks your source, your methods, the aggregation, the classification, the symbolization anyway. And I just quite enjoy that, you read this particular cartoon, it gets to the bottom. Let's make every map basically lets you make fun of Florida anyway, which is half the point. So I took all my maps of elections and I thought, well, let's turn that into an atlas of design choices. And those maps became the starting point for the book I've written fairly recently, which is really ostensibly how to design thematic maps. 101 of them to be precise. That's a lie, by the way. There's not 101 maps in the book. It's a different number. And I use a consistent data set. So the differences in design allow you to see how the map mediates the message. And I used the 2016 presidential election data because I'd already started making the maps, and then things politically got a little bit hot, but I'd already started making the maps and I wasn't going to start again. So that's why it's the 2016 data. It's not a new idea either. Many people have said to me, well, that's a great idea. Well, it's not my idea. I stole it. A chap called E.P. Herman did it in 1922 for maps on sales visualizations, would you believe? And Jacques Bertin did it the same in semiology. He used a chapter and presented 100 maps of a single data set. So it's not new. But it did allow me to go through a whole series of issues. And I'm going to run through a lot of slides here very quickly, because most of us here know the sorts of things I'm talking about, but I just want to give you a flavor of the ideas that I put in the book. So we start with map preparation, and among the first topic, I deal with map projections. Obviously, it's important to emphasize that thematic maps of statistical data demand equal area projections. I mean, how many maps do we see on Web Mercator? We still do. It shouldn't be the case. But because Web Mercator's default on many web map platforms, that's the one that people use. But it distorts the maps, which creates all sorts of visual incongruities for the reader. I can get into color. Let's deal with accessibility issues. Let's deal with layout. You bring Alaska and Hawaii in the US down to the bottom left as insets. Let's deal with different color visions. Deuteranopia lacking the ability to see green. I wanted to test in particular with the red and blue. So in order to be able to understand that red blue does actually work, to test those issues, I was able to also talk about, basically what is the modifiable aerial unit problem, or redistricting or gerrymandering, decisions of where boundaries are placed that has a huge impact on how data is aggregated, but also how data is understood through the mechanism of the map. This idea that people look at the map and believe that is how things are distributed is as much a function of, the way in which the data are collected and organized as it is anything else. Now, we know that, but the general public often don't know that. So being able to describe that and illustrate that, I think, is important, and to reinforce that message. And then we can use real examples. Here's a very famous congressional district, the 4th Congressional District of Illinois, one of the most oddest in US political history. Basically, it's over time been shown to be accused of redistricting to group Latino populations. It's basically a racially biased redistricting opportunity, really to put all of those communities in exactly the same pot for electoral tallying of results. So everything else goes one way and this goes the other way. These districts go, this district goes the other way. Well, that's an ethical question for sure, but one where the map is used as both an input and an output to decision making. So when we actually question the ethics of map makers, we also often have to understand that there's aspects that they can't change. I can't change the congressional districts, but if I'm making a map, these are the boundaries I have to use. Of course, I have to go through things like classification. This is the total number of votes for Republicans by county, and I bore myself to tears talking about normalizing choropleths, but these sorts of maps are very frequently made because very few people, I should say, understand that you have to turn it into the rate here to account for massively different population bases that sit underneath the voting data. So now this is a percentage share of vote for the Republican Party. And of course, you get a completely different message from the map. You show people that map, one message. You show people that map, another message, exactly the same data. And depending on how you classify it, of course, you get very different versions. It comes down to how much red you want on your map. So, if I was the guy making the map for Trump, I'd have a look at this and go, right, bottom right. Yes, please. Most red. And I've not even talked about, the strengths of reds I've symbolized with here. Then we get into maps on areas, and the chapters dealing with areas, points, lines, cartograms, graphs, charts, and so on and so on. And here's the standard blue-red map of the election. I had a little bit of cross-hatching to show those states that had flipped, just because it adds, I think, detail and context. They're the ones that really matter. Those 5 or 6 states that flipped to give Trump the victory. But the one thing I want to point out is you'll notice there's scribbles all over the map, and these are in the actual book where I call out particularly interesting aspects of either the technique or what it does to the message of the map. And I think actually that was designed as a way to kind of show what a cartographic editorial process might appear like when we're looking at our own work and reflecting on things that the map does or doesn't do, or identifying errors or mistakes. But I thought it was a useful technique to show other people what goes on. And I've actually come to the realization, I think it goes beyond that, because a lot of people have said to me when they've seen these scribbles, oh, that really puts into context what the map shows. So this idea that, a picture's worth 1,000 words, or maybe a map is worth more than 1,000 words, I think is incorrect. I think the marriage of the map with annotations that helps people understand what it is we're trying to show in the map is the perfect way forward. So let's not necessarily leave the map to tell the whole story and assume that the map reader can understand it all. Give them a helping hand. Let's put some annotations on maps to help that message be much more easily understood, particularly, of course, if they're unfamiliar with the geography or the data set that's being mapped. These help people massively. But we can get into more interesting techniques. maybe this value by alpha map to downplay the massive population disparities in the states. Maybe we use a blended hue with purple in the middle to show mixing of reds and blues instead of, you know, a diverging color scheme that has white in the middle. Maybe we go a step further and add some hill shading, just to make it slightly more artistic, maybe to emphasize some of the largely populated counties. We use hill shading on topographic maps to accentuate elevation, to show where elevation exists. Why not do it on a statistical map as well? So borrowing techniques from elsewhere to make thematic maps sing a little bit more. Or, of course, we can remove detail. That's what cartographers are extremely good at, is omission of information. Here is just the counties that flipped. And these are important because it's where campaigning is targeted. It's where elections are won or lost. So let's mute all those areas that voted the same in 2012 and 2016, because this is what we're left with. These are just the counties that flipped, and by how much. And for me, at least, it was surprisingly few. I thought it was way more than this. And in fact, actually, Trump won off the back of flipping Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. That's just 3 states, by less than 1%, which equates to roughly 80,000 people in each state, which is such a minute margin of victory, particularly when you think back to the map that he put on the White House wall, which was all red. Those two stories are you know, diametrically opposed, and fundamentally interesting that the map on his wall doesn't show that reality. We could look at trends using small multiples. The interesting thing here, I think, this sort of map or set of maps invites more questions, provokes interest in this circumstances that, for instance, led to large swings between certain election cycles, and where some states flip often, and why some states used to be very Republican but are now firmly Democrat, and vice versa. And what would a map look like on the White House wall if Clinton had won that particular election? Maybe this one, a proportional circle symbol map of the popular vote. And of course, it's predominantly blue because Clinton took many small counties with very large populations, whereas Trump, by contrast, took many more counties, but they were way, way smaller. And as we know, though, the popular vote doesn't count. So the massive small red symbols ultimately overawed the much larger blue symbols. But this map is no more or less correct or incorrect than Trump's version. I mean, curiously, in some respects, this is a map Trump might actually have used to good effect. You know, I won't do the impression, but look at all the blue, and yet we still won. I mean, that's quite a message as well. Or we could go a little bit, you know, silly, you know, riff off some party symbology, create proportional symbols reporting the electoral result. We can go back to my version of the daisyometric dot density map, but you know what this really does is emphasize how much of the US is unpopulated or very sparsely populated, rather than the maps that exhaust space with solid color fills. Beyond that very early screen grab that I shared on Twitter that I shouldn't have done really, I actually made, you know, the map proper in the end, made it into a poster. And I found actually if you include some topographic detail, particularly some hill shade in this case, which is fairly rare on a straightforward thematic map, it actually helps explain the settlement patterns in the US as well as showing the results. So it kind of explains why there's so much sparseness, particularly in the western half of the US compared to the eastern half. You know, these are pretty interesting landscapes, mountainous or deserts, or you know, vast stretches of plains which are predominantly uninhabitable in many respects, and so you only get populations in very small, highly concentrated areas. And I updated it for 2020. Here's the Biden-Harris victory over Trump and Pence, exactly the same. 1 dot equals 1 daisyometric dot density approach. 1 dot equals 1 vote. Cycle through the 2. I mean, the symbology is slightly more pronounced on the second version, but it's exactly the same map because the actual relative number of votes didn't really change much. It just flipped back to the Democrats. Okay, there's an argument you could obfuscate data through map symbology, but why not put the numbers on the map itself? Here, the labels are the literal symbol, with a little color, size, and transparency, creating depth in the field of view. Kind of interesting because people can hone in exactly on the numbers. Or we can go abstract, break away from the hard boundaries of administrative areas, create an isoplex or a contoured map. Maybe we could use illuminated contours, maybe use that blended hue approach again. It's a predominantly purple map, which is not what many of the result maps suggest. We could look at places that are dissimilar by using symbology to show boundaries. Imagine a chat over you and your neighbour's fence. How's the conversation going to go? How did you vote yesterday? This map shows where neighbours voted the same way and by how much. It also shows where neighbours voted for a different candidate and by how much. What you actually end up with, interestingly, is large tracts of the US voting in very similar ways, punctuated by small enclaves of differing support. And some of those are actually American Indian reservations, which is fascinating, particularly if you look in the top middle, up in the Dakotas and that kind of area. And this, apart from those outliers to that principle, speaks very much towards Waldo Tobler's first law of geography, that near things are more similar to one another than things that are further apart. And it's an interesting map to reveal that story in election data. Maybe you're interested in the swing and you mute out all of those counties that haven't changed very, very much or changed at all. Maybe you're interested in making a map that looks like the Stars and Stripes. This is just transects across the country through the data points, through an interpolated surface. But the interesting thing with this map, actually, many people find this map is one of their favorites in the book. But there's so much data missing from this map because it's really only, like I said, a dozen or so transects. Most of the map is in between, most of the data is in between the transects. So it's missing from the map where it's on every other map, really. Is that important? I don't know. Is it ethical? Is it truthful? And I'll go quickly through cartograms because we know what a cartogram is. We can get inventive with them to accommodate different population densities by warping geography in fantastical different ways. People love or hate these kind of things. I happen to really like them. Many people don't like them at all. This one creates feelings of nausea amongst certain audiences that I've shown the maps to. This one is actually Trump's map that hangs on the wall, or hung on the wall. It's just contorted by population density. And look how much it squeezes the reds from his map and expands the blues a little bit more to put them into balance. Or a Dawling cartogram, mashed up with a Chernoff face represent. We're getting into crazy stuff here to pack a considerable amount of information, but you get to the point where you have to question readability. What's this map actually? What's it show? What's it proving? I don't think complexity is bad in cartography because if it's presented with care and legibility, it does invite scrutiny and inspection and gets people immersed into the map where they explore it. But I'm not sure. I don't like this. I don't think it works very well. This is the other end of the spectrum. By contrast, the quick throwaway infographic of decorating numbers. These are proportional balloons, but it's a non-map. But does it tell the story of the result? The bunch of party balloons with slightly more and slightly bigger reds than blues. That's it. The map's largely irrelevant. They're just there to add decoration. Or some charts, maybe a waffle grid. This fascinated me because it shows how actually even voting is. I mean, it's broadly 50-50 in most states. There's only a few states where it's much more predominantly one party than the other. I found that a fascinating story, which Sankey diagrams to show the flow from one electoral cycle to another also illustrated. Now, most of the book illustrates maps that I think are designed to show what you can do and what might be considered best practices, but this one's a bit different. It illustrates how to make a wonderfully impactful map that's broadly useless. And it's again, Trump's choropleth, but with Z-axis encoding for total votes. Occlusion, foreshortening, it's pretty for sure. It's engaging in that sense. But I think useless if you want to gain any real insight and to understand the results. But of course, that doesn't mean that 3D isn't useful. You can create isometric projections. So foreshortening is the same across the map. Doesn't change. You could go with gridded cartograms. You can slice and dice things using interactives, which makes things kind of interesting. You could use some fairly fancy symbology, signposting, which way states voted through time, to create some temporal information. Or, and this map isn't in the book, but I threw this one in because it won a BCS award, the Garsdale Award, a couple of years ago. This is the other map I made in lockdown, just by an old bit of kitchen countertop and some screws and a bit of paint, just for the hell of it. Okay, so nearly there. So I've kind of shown very briefly a range of maps from the book, which is kind of my attempt to encourage people to look at good examples and to therefore be able to have something to choose from when they're deciding what it is that they want to make their map look like. The point is, with so many design choices, you know, these so-called fake maps or alternative maps are abound, and you can make a map to say anything you want. People still make them, but as I hope I've showed, we've always made those kinds of maps. And some are going to speak to you more than others, and some speak to me more than others in the book, even as I was making them. You have likes and you have dislikes. But I think if you're designing maps to report empirical data, it kind of behoves you to appreciate how the choices you make as a map maker are going to impact how the map's going to be read. And I think more widely, being able to recognize bias in a map's representation is a very important issue, because of the fact that maps play to people's views, opinions, and search for the truth. So all maps are going to lie to an extent. And I think a better way of thinking about it, perhaps, is it's the extent of that lie that's important to recognize and keep in mind. And to maybe lessen the extent of the lie, if you see what I mean. But of course, thematic maps never finished, because if they were, I'd be out of a job. But with new election cycles, congressional district boundaries are going to change. Here's the way in which Texas is changing for 2024. And basically, Republicans are within their rights to change boundaries. So they're redistricting to create districts that are more partisan, to concede Democratic strongholds, but make them much smaller, therefore make them less important in the overall tallying of the result. So lose the marginal districts, and there's less chance of a swing or a flip. Is it legal? Yes. Is it ethical or even democratic? I have an opinion, but we will all have our opinions on that. What's clear here, though, is that the map is not just being used to report; it's being used to inform change and to recognise where policy might change, to change the map in a way in which you might think creates a more unethical map. It's not the map's fault. It's rather those that are using it or abusing it to make decisions. And whatever they do, the underlying distribution of voters will likely remain reasonably unchanged anyway. This map shows where people live. That's not going to change. Where people vote, that's probably not going to change. And the way they vote is also probably not going to change, even though the catchments in which their votes are counted will change. There have been real consequences of the maps I've made for election data. So in 2016, Trump flipped and won Wisconsin by 0.77%, less than 1%. And this left map is the result of the style of map on his wall. And I was contacted in the run-up to the 2020 election by a Democratic campaign manager who had obviously seen some of my work and who wanted a map that showed the result of the 2016 election, but which also gave encouragement to the thousands of campaigners in Wisconsin. He kind of explained to me that they couldn't understand how the map could be so red if the margin of the result was so small. this is the problem, isn't it? This is the fundamental problem, that the map was telling a very specific story and they didn't get it, couldn't understand it. So I made him a much larger scale version of the dot density approach map. And I gave it to him and he got back to me. And it basically shows a almost 50-50 reality. And it's virtually all purple. And he got back to me and said that actually really did change things and helped, because it gave his campaigners encouragement that they weren't just dealing with going to fundamentally, red voting places, that it was far more balanced and nuanced than that overarching map had represented. And I hate to take any credit for American politics, and I'm probably not allowed to anyway, but Wisconsin went Democratic in 2020. So, is every map you could ever make in that book I've written? No, because just after I'd written it, this map came out of the Washington Post, and I really loved it. It's a proportional symbol map, but in areas with lots of voting precincts, the large areas, large populations, small land areas, they broke the map out into small localized Dawling cartograms. So it's basically a mix of two different approaches. I really like that kind of thing, because if one accusation against a cartogram can be leveled, it's that you lose geography, and therefore people don't understand what it is they're looking at when they're trying to interpret things. And with this kind of hybrid approach, you get that sense of geography still, but those localized detail, almost insets, but in place insets. So I'll have to write another book. So I guess, what I've found over maybe the last decade or so is I've become a little bit more pragmatic in the way I think about map making, and in particular my place in the map making world of encouragement. And I really like the way Alberto Cairo put it last year, that we should probably move away from thinking about hard and fast rules and codes, mantras, and simply move towards giving people just good examples to follow with explanations to aid the interpretation, whether it's for people making maps or those trying to make sense of the map they're reading. And I guess by leading by example and by explaining our own thought processes, then rather than just telling people that the map doesn't work without an explanation, that's where I see professionalism, and I see the value of the profession, the profession that we're all in, is being able to communicate not just the map or map design ideas, but the knowledge behind those ideas and the best practices that we recognize and that we push as ways of better mapping. So we don't make maps according to rules, really, I don't think. Though many of us have to work to specs or under editorial policies through employment. We don't all have freedom, total freedom to design how we want. We're not all free from constraint. So I think rather than stipulate rules, maybe it's better to simply identify these best practices and establish why it's considered best practice, and to go into more detail about those whys rather than simply the illustration of the map design output. As I've said, people have, and they will continue to make maps, and they're going to try and push boundaries, and they're going to try and push the cartographic practice going forward, whatever lists or codes we may wish to come up with, because people aren't going to read them anyway. And many will and have and will continue to actually delight in going against the perceived wisdom of the so-called experts. So I think we should be relaxed about, be a bit more relaxed about that and not feed it. So the important aspect, I think, is intent, and every mark on a map needs to be intentional, as we'd probably agree. But being able to justify it, I think, is the important context. All the way from, well, I just like it. I picked that color because I like it. All the way from that to referencing systematic studies that show important cognitive concepts, which I know we all sort of believe in to an extent. And I think discussion and critique and self-evaluation is an extremely important part of that whole process. So whenever you make a map, whatever data you have on hand, without checking to see if it's relevant, useful, or accurate for the goals you have in mind, whoever you are, you're going to run the risk of missing the mark. And X doesn't always mark the spot, as Robert Louis Stevenson's classic Treasure Island map revealed. The treasure was not buried where X was. So no matter how well designed, aesthetically pleasing, believable a map may appear to be, they can tell completely fictitious lies. So I'm going to end with one final map, or pair of maps that are in the book, and an appropriate musical accompaniment.
But you see, the winner takes it all. The winner takes it all.
And with that, I thank you very much. If you're still there, you might not still be there. I don't know. But thank you very much for spending some time with me this evening and listening to my thoughts. Appreciate it very, very much. Thank you.
Ken, thank you. Hugely entertaining, enormously thought-provoking, your usual fantastic quality of talking. Brilliant. Thank you very much. I don't know if anybody's got any questions. Have you got some time to take a few questions, if there are any?
We're going to find out if anybody's won the competition yet.
Well, how do you want to do that?
I just want to, if somebody can put, if anybody wants to play, you can put it in the chat, and we can
So
see.
that's first up in the chat to get it right, is it, Wins?
Yeah, let's do first up in the chat. So I want the number of musical references, and if you get them all right and you reference the actual bands, then even better.
So you don't want too much. We're going to be here for about another hour then, are we?
It's only midday for me. I've got all day. I haven't even cracked a beer yet. It's way too early.
Dear, oh dear.
All right, yeah, okay. The number. Let's go with the number. First one to give me the right number of musical references. So you can just guess at that.
We've had several giving you 7. Obviously, that's not the right number?
Actually, 7 is the right number. So whoever said 7 first of all can have the book. And
no, let's. Who was it? We had Lorraine. Yeah, Lorraine Rupp. With a question mark.
Someone's got a list there as well, though, Seppi, of them all.
Well, I know, but
next down.
Now let's just go with the number.
There you go. So Lorraine, she wasn't very certain. There was a question mark there, but looks like you got it right, Lorraine. Well done.
All right, so I need to contact Lorraine, or Lorraine to contact me, and I'll figure that out. So it was Eric Clapton, Manic Street Preachers, Miley Cyrus, REM, Talking Heads, Pink Floyd, and ABBA.
Well done to Paul Wainwright, who actually did get 7 and actually listed them all as well.
All right, well, Paul can have a book as well. Go on then.
Well done, Paul. There you go.
Paul Wainwright, was that?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, if Lorraine and Paul can get in touch with me, send me an email or DM me on Twitter or something, then we'll figure that out. I've got hundreds of damn things to get rid of.
Excellent. That's brilliant. Has anybody got any questions they want to put into the chat? Or I'm just I don't think there's any questions. There are lots of thank yous, whoop whoop, and a whoop whoop from Lorraine. So she's obviously very pleased about that. I can't see actually any questions in the chat.
Oh, come on! There must be questions.
Oh, I'm sure there are.
Questions like, why was the book launch delayed, or has there been any problems with the theme, the subject matter of your book, or
well, yeah,
all the stuff that I'm not allowed to talk about.
Rachel's just pushing you on. What's your next book?
Oh, it's an interesting question. So I've actually got 3 ideas, and I'm not going to tell you what they are, because then somebody might go off and write the book, and then I'm in, But the interesting question was, and I think I've recounted this story somewhere else before, but when I was writing the first book, which was really my attempt to just brain dump everything I knew about mapping in one book, that was it. I thought, I'm going to get one shot to do this. And I remember Alberto Cairo, who saw an early draft of the book, his first question was, and he was just sat there reading it in front of me, and he said to me, all right, what's your second book going to be? And I just laughed at him. I haven't got any more. There's no more content. There is nothing. I put everything I possibly could into the first book, and then I thought of this one idea for the second book, and I actually got him to write the foreword for this, and just said, "Yeah, you were right." And he said, "Yeah, I told you you'd write another one." So it's a bit like a bug. Honestly, it gets to you. You just it's. I find it quite a creative outlet. You know, not only making the maps, but also writing around the maps, and that idea of narrating what it is you're trying to do, I think, is really, really quite fun. I did actually have somebody in Vienna at the Eurocarto conference towards the end of last year talking to me about the book, and they were like, "Great, where did you get all the maps?" I said, "Well, I made them." And they were like, You made them?" I was, yeah. It's kind of what I do, you know.
There is a question here from Jim Goldsmith. Does Trump follow you on Twitter?
Jim, I sent the ex-president a copy of my book when he was still president, hoping that it might encourage slightly better awareness of graphical and cartographical work in his own communication, but I didn't get a reply. I have had Twitter conversations with Mark Hamill, also known as Luke Skywalker, and I hold that as one of my very greatest achievements in life. Also with Ricky Gervais and someone else I can't quite remember, but sadly not Trump. I'll try and get Musk, or maybe not.
I think Mark Hamill's a better result than Trump anyway. So
yeah. No, I had a little conversation with Mark Hamill, and I was like, I was leaping around for days with that, like a little child. Anyway, Twitter's dead anyway, isn't it? I think it's gone. I think I'm about the only person left on it. But
well, we're sort of coming up to 8:30. I don't know. There's not really any questions. I guess you've just blown everybody away, or maybe it's just too late here for people to go into the real, you know, to really get deep down into the fundamentals of things. There is some fascinating things that come out of everything you said, and it would be really interesting to talk more about it. But I guess we haven't really got time today.
Okay. I think they're probably all asleep, Seppi.
Well, maybe. Oh, hang on. There's something here. Brendan White just come up with something with "do no harm," which was a comment that Jim put in right at the beginning, which was at one point. With "do no harm," how does that play with our military cartographers? So basically, when Jim was saying what's the principle behind making a map, one of the principles that Jim said was "do no harm."
Yeah, I think "do no harm" is probably a fairly good overarching principle, isn't it? I mean, it probably encapsulates everything. It would have been a much shorter talk if Jim had given it. I think the point is, you know, that idea that I don't think any map is made without constraint, and there's a whole spectrum or a continuum of that, you know, from, you know, maps that are just made by an independent person making it for social media publishing, all the way through to national map agencies or military mapping. You know, we all have these contexts for why the map is being produced, and I think from a standpoint of understanding map lies, you just have to recognize that the map you're reading comes with its very specific set of lies. I mean, why would a military map publish what it's not mapping? I mean, that would be stupid as well.
Yeah.
But, you know, as long as you know that the map is being developed for, I mean, you know, what about maps of, you know, current conflict zones? How do we feel about those? You know, we're making maps to support military activity.
Yeah, can I just let me ask you a question then while we're doing this? And I've got a comment here that somebody's not asleep and they're really enjoying it. The idea of sort of verifying your data, which you talked about at one point, and actually being able to recognize that, is there a case for putting stuff on maps in the way, I don't know, that would reflect that? I don't know, in the way that we say reflect what's in our food. You know, how much salt is there? How much sugar is there in this particular map? what sources is it? How do I mean, it might be very difficult to do, but in some way to reflect the choices that you're making to the person who's reading.
That's almost like metadata for map design, isn't it? You know, something that sits alongside the map that, yeah, basically shows you the ingredients. But I think if you could have a traffic light system, you know, is a map red, orange, or green? I think you would still get into the territory of if the map maker is responsible for identifying their own ingredients, that too could be quite easily massaged. And then the counter is if, you know, an independent authority or societies or body of experts does that badging, you know, then you're going to get people say, I don't care anyway. You can, yeah. I think it's a good idea. That said though, you know, you walk into any supermarket and of course those lists exist. But we all still buy and eat crap food, don't we? Because it's tasty.
Yeah.
So,
Very true.
you know, what am I going to buy? Am I going to buy that apple or that beautiful chocolate cake? I tell you what, treat myself to a bit of chocolate cake. And you kind of know what's in it, but you just ignore it anyway. And maybe that's how it would end up. Yeah, I know that map's not ready, but it looks great. I'm going to look at that map. I don't know. It's an interesting thought.
Paul Wainwright just asked a question. Commentators, MSM seem more happy challenging misuse of stats and data rather than calling it out on maps. Why do you think that could be?
Because I don't think people question maps because it's an image. The data's not right in your face. The data has been interpreted and put on the map. And the natural assumption by most people is that must be therefore correct. So I think that process of turning data into imagery gets rid of a lot of that problem in terms of the people that are making the maps. And it's really only us talking to ourselves that can recognize when we see a poorly designed map. But that's part of the job, isn't it? Hasn't a cartographer always been someone who takes a data set and, you know, massages it into something that says something? And we would hope that is an objective product. I mean, I was always taught during my studies, you know, maps have to, you know, keep the user in mind. And I mean, I probably heard that phrase about 3,000 times during my degree. Keep the user in mind. Oh, keep the bloody user in mind all the time. But, you know, you're then making a map to suit a particular person, not necessarily everybody, or not necessarily that user group or that user group. So that's our art, taking data and fudging it into something that somebody's going to appreciate.
Another question here. From, obviously, all the book readers are keen now to ask you questions. So, Lorraine Matt, do you think that viewers want to believe maps are all true?
Yeah, why wouldn't we? Well, I don't want to watch a news program or read a newspaper where I'm constantly having to think, I wonder if that map's true. Is it telling me a lie? I think that it's just an innate assumption that the maps we see in our media feeds are correct. And as I sort of alluded to halfway through, you know, if you're getting your diet of news from, I'll just pick on them, Daily Mail, Daily Express, Sun, are the maps you see in those kind of publications different to the maps you might see in the Financial Times, I don't know, Guardian, Times? Now they are, because you can look at them, and Peter Viakovic has done a lot of work looking at media maps and how they use different editorial standards and different editorial imagery and tropes to tell the story of using the same data but in very different ways. But we're always going to read a newspaper or read a website that plays to our opinions anyway. And over here, it's, if you're a Democrat, you're going to watch CNN, and if you're a Republican, you're going to watch Fox News. So you can bet that the maps you see on those two news cable networks will be designed to speak to those cohorts, those populations.
Paul's just sent a message. I don't know if you've seen it, Ken. I'm a big fan of Private Eye, and they're always calling out issues in the numbers, just moving up, quoted by politicians. Maybe I need to write in more often and draw their attention to the bias in maps.
Please do. It saved me having to do it all the time. Someone else can be
There's
accused
there was a very good series on Radio 4 where they call out, they look at stats and sort of look at the numbers behind them and where they come from and sort of challenge them. Maybe we should be doing that with, the industry should be doing that with maps.
Well, it's very interesting because if you go back to, I think it's the late 1960s, the Royal Society actually published a very, very famous, well, famous in our circles, I guess, document that claimed one of the major roles for professionals and societies was to call out examples of subpar work in the generality. So, maybe for a very simple example, somebody who's not a cartographer makes a map and the map doesn't actually conform to professional standards and therefore tells some form of mistruth. And it's our job to call them out. That's actually, and I actually still to some extent think that's a really valuable thing that we should be doing. Things have changed a little bit though in terms of how you do it, and the arena in which you do it, and whether you contact people privately, or whether I used to take the view that if somebody's pushed a map out on social media, it's fair game because it's a public map. But that doesn't always go down well. I mean, I've had very different experiences when I've tried to explain why maps don't work through a series of tweets. Some people have railed heavily against it and, called me out on picking on people, or thinking I'm picking on people, or not. I'm picking on the piece of work. I don't mind. It doesn't bother me who did it. And other people have actually come back to me and said, thanks, that's been really valuable. I've learned something. And, you sit back and think, well, that's one person less who's going to make that error next time they make a map. So you're never going to get everybody, on side. One of the interesting communities at the moment is climate, meteorology, data science, who continue to use, rainbow color schemes for everything. And, they have been through many, many pieces of literature exposed as being not the best way of representing many quantitative data sets that are in a sequential. But they won't listen. It's ingrained. That's the way in which those communities have been taught to represent that kind of data. And it's fascinating, the responses, really fascinating. And it's like, the better versions of responses have been, yeah, but we get it, so we don't need to change it because we understand it. Our community understands it. And my response to that would be, well, that's fine. That's fine. But don't go and push it out, across a news outlet or through social media, expecting the general public to be able to interpret the work in the same way that you do. A map made for a professional body of people who understand it is very different to a map made for general consumption. So I think you could make a different version of a map for general consumption. That's all I'm saying. So it takes, if we're going to go down that route of maybe seeing our roles, or seeing the role of a society or societies as being to try to improve things, I think we've got to tread very carefully and find ways of bringing people on board more easily. I would just like people to value cartography a bit more. Data science is one at the moment. There's this whole set of things that people seem to think a data scientists need. Statistical knowledge, programming knowledge, AI, machine learning knowledge. Hardly anywhere do you get listed visualization and cartography. They do all of the stuff in processing of the data, but then basically whatever default the software is that they're using is how the thing is presented. I would add that, the actual presentation is as important to help get their message across. But you know, that's something that maybe we have to encourage them to see as something valuable as part of their profession.
Brilliant, Ken. Thank you. I think we got one comment from Paul, which I'll just read out to end off. The maps don't lie is a fundamental contradiction. All maps have to lie. That's what makes them useful. A non-lying map would have to be at 1:1 scale and include everything that exists. Paul, that sounds like the sort of time for a beer around the bar. Let's have a good argument about things time.
Well, can I go one further than Paul?
Yeah.
Why maps? Let's just stick to globes. Then we won't have to project the damn things. Everything should be on a globe. There you go.
Brilliant. I think on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much, Ken. Really brilliant. I think
Pleasure.
Everybody, lots of comments on people enjoying it. It was really good, very good. I hope that we can pick this up and continue it by sitting in the in-person, as many as possible, coming to the 60th conference in Cambridge. It's going to be exciting to see people again, and certainly going to have a lot of time to catch up with, chatting at the bars and things. So I hope as many of people who are here tonight, we will see you in September. Unfortunately, whoever just said, oh, Brendan from Canberra, probably we won't see you, Brendan, but you know, you never know. If you can make it over to Cambridge in the UK in September, love to see you. So big thank you, Ken. Thanks to everybody for being here tonight. Really enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you all at the next talk. Don't forget, there's a Tea Time Talk Map Memoir a week on Thursday, which if you came to the first one was fascinating. We got 3 equally interesting speakers to talk about their favorite map and why it influenced them. So thank you all very much, and see you all soon.